Welcome to another deep dive. You've pulled together a really compelling set of materials for us this time, all centered on Hypatia of Alexandria, a truly fascinating figure.
Yes, and we've got quite the mix. Scholarly looks at Synesius's letters, historical takes on her death, and how she's been seen much later.
Right, from those intimate letters to, well, the conflicting accounts of her end, and then how centuries later people are still talking about her, painting her, making films.
Exactly. And the goal really is to sift through all this rich, sometimes contradictory material and pull out the most intriguing and important insights about who Hypatia actually was.
Okay, let's start with maybe the most personal evidence we have, those letters between Hypatia and Synesius. They seem like our best window into her as a teacher, a mentor.
They really are. And one key argument is that these weren't just, friendly notes. They suggest Hypatia was right in the middle of big debates about paideia.
Paideia, that's the whole classical Greek model of education and culture, right? And the debate was how, or even if, it fit within a rising Christian framework.
Precisely. It shows she wasn't isolated in some pagan intellectual bubble. She was engaging with influential Christians like Synesius, involved in shaping how they thought about their own intellectual
So
traditions.
it wasn't a simple pagan versus Christian thing.
Not at all. Alexandria was a melting pot. As Christianity grew stronger, big questions arose. What do we do with Plato? With Homer? Do these classical texts still have value? Hypatia, being a top Hellenic intellectual, would have been central to that conversation.
But there's another view, isn't there, that maybe Synesius is using Hypatia in his letters more symbolically.
Yes, that's a really interesting point. Some scholars argue we should see Hypatia in these letters almost as like an embodiment of philosophy itself, rather than a purely historical snapshot.
So Synesius is crafting an image, maybe.
Well, possibly. We need to remember these letters had social and literary purposes, too. They weren't just private emails. Helmut Sang, for instance, looked at how Synesius uses the relationship to shape his own persona. So, invaluable glimpses, yes, but maybe through a curated lens.
That idea gets stronger when you look at Synesius's work, Dio. He actually sent it to her for approval.
He did. He explicitly asked for her judgment and said he wouldn't release it publicly if she thought it wasn't good enough. That speaks volumes about her standing, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Incredible respect. And Dio itself, what was it really about? Not just specific Christian factions like Origenists.
It seems broader than that. The argument is Synesius was pushing back against certain, let's say, ideological trends. There was this tension, this competition for authority between the traditional Hellenic intellectuals like Hypatia and the growing influence of certain monastic figures.
A kind of culture war over who held intellectual and spiritual authority, with classical literature caught in the crossfire.
Pretty much. And Hypatia, representing that classical tradition, was right at the heart of it. Synesius and Dio seems to defend that tradition against those who felt it was, well, unnecessary for piety.
He criticizes those men in white robes, right? Possibly monks.
Yes, likely a reference to some monastic groups he felt were perhaps intellectually shallow, despite their devotion. He implies Hypatia, and maybe even Bishop Theophilus at the time, would agree with his frustration.
It's interesting, he contrasts the monks' barbaric constitution, strong but rigid maybe, with the Hellenic, which he sees as more refined but maybe more fragile.
Yeah, he seems to be arguing for the lasting value of classical learning, its nuance. He wasn't necessarily slamming asceticism itself, but rather the dismissal of literature.
He saw literature as maybe a gentler path to understanding human complexity.
Something like that. A more charming way, as he put it, perhaps suited for those not drawn to harsh asceticism. So Dio is really a defense of classical learning in a shifting world, and Hypatia is central, both as his teacher and as a symbol.
Her approval was clearly crucial for him.
Definitely. And again, remembering the literary nature of the letters, they were crafted pieces. We need to read them understanding that layer of representation.
Okay, so the letters paint her as this deeply respected intellectual, but then we turn to the historical accounts of her death. And, well, things get much more complicated and violent. Socrates Scholasticus is the main source here.
He is. And one interpretation from Walter Beers suggests Socrates isn't really focused on Hypatia per se.
Oh, who is he focused on then?
Possibly Cyril of Alexandria, the bishop. Beers argues the narrative might be more about documenting Cyril's growing power, how the bishop's office was gaining influence in secular matters. Maybe even Empress Pulcheria is lurking in the background politically.
So Hypatia's death becomes a way to illustrate the dangers of that unchecked episcopal power.
That's the idea. It highlights the volatility and the shifting tower dynamics in Alexandria. Pulcheria's potential involvement just adds another layer of imperial politics.
Then there's that shattered icon idea from Morel Haas. That's quite striking.
It really is. The idea is that Socrates uses the memory of the destruction of the Serapis cult statue in the Serapeum.
A huge event in Alexandria.
Exactly. He uses that well-known destruction as a kind of symbolic code, a metaphor, to talk about Hypatia's murder, which might have been too dangerous or shocking to describe directly and explicitly.
So, smashing the statue becomes a stand-in for the violence done to her, a way to convey the horror without getting into every detail.
Precisely. Haas argues Socrates draws parallels, using the vivid known image of iconoclasm to evoke the brutality inflicted on Hypatia.
And Haas also suggests this wasn't just a random mob, right?
No, her reading points towards something more premeditated, maybe by young, zealous clergy members, the Parabolani, perhaps trying to gain favor with Cyril.
And the timing during Lent.
Yes, that makes it even more shocking in Socrates' account. A period meant for piety and reflection becoming the backdrop for such brutality seems intended to raise eyebrows, maybe implicitly criticize Cyril's oversight, or worse.
Socrates calls her Idelpos, the poor creature. That feels significant too.
Hosek thinks so. It conveys pity, emphasizes the humiliation she endured. It subtly frames the attackers negatively and underscores the tragedy, perhaps directing criticism towards those ultimately responsible.
Now, the method, the estaka, that word has caused a lot of debate. Gibbon's image of sharp shells used for flaying is quite famous.
It is famous, but probably inaccurate. More recent scholarship, including Hosse's work, makes a strong case against it. There's just no real archaeological or literary backup for shells being used as, like, razor weapons.
So what were ostraka more likely to be?
Pottery sherds, broken pieces of pots, which would have been, everywhere in a city like Alexandria,
Right.
readily available debris.
So essentially she was stoned to death with broken pottery.
That seems much more likely. Haas points out this fits other accounts of urban violence where mobs used whatever was at hand, pottery shards, roof tiles thrown as projectiles. It's less lurid than shells, perhaps, but just as brutal.
It definitely paints a picture of chaotic, opportunistic urban violence.
Exactly, and it shows how interpreting even one word can shift our understanding. Then you have to contrast Socrates with someone like John of Nikiu writing later.
Right. His chronicle gives a totally different picture.
Completely different. Hypatia becomes this dangerous witch, basically, a sorceress who is the sole reason for the conflict between the prefect Orestes and Cyril. It's a stark example of how her image got twisted over time, demonized in certain Christian narratives.
And we also have Damascus, the Neoplatonist philosopher. He praises her virtues, but includes that strange story.
The menstrual cloth anecdote, yeah. He uses it to deter an infatuated student. It's odd.
What's the thinking behind including that? It mentions the impurity of birth.
Well, Damascus is writing from within that Neoplatonist tradition, emphasizing virtues like detachment. The impurity of birth is debated could be about the material world, physical generation, maybe even societal views on women, but Damascus seems to use the story, however bizarre, to show Hypatia rejecting physical desire, embodying the ideal of the detached philosopher.
Though Damascus could be a bit satirical too, couldn't he?
He certainly could. So we have Socrates, John of Nikiu, Damascus, all offering these quite different, often conflicting views, clearly shaped by their own agendas and times.
It really highlights how tough it is to get a single, clear picture. Each source adds a piece, but the full image is blurry.
Definitely. It's a mosaic, and some pieces are missing, others might be colored by bias.
Okay, let's shift then to her own context. What can we actually say about her religious beliefs? Probably traditional paganism.
That seems most likely. David Frankfurter's work is helpful here. He talks about how, in the 4th and 5th centuries, as public pagan ceremonies declined under Christian pressure, traditional religion often became more private, centered on the home.
So domestic rituals, family traditions, that sort of thing.
Probably. Less about the big public temples, which were under threat or already gone, and more about personal and household practices.
And philosophically, she's a Neoplatonist. But there's this persistent idea that she was maybe just focused on mathematics, a geometer.
Yeah, that view is challenged quite strongly. Sebastian Goertz, for example, argues that viewing her as just a mathematician misses the point of Neoplatonism at the time.
How so?
Well, for Neoplatonists like Plotinus or Porphyry before her, mathematics wasn't the end goal. It was crucial, yes, but as a preparation. a necessary step for training the mind to grasp higher, non-material realities, metaphysics, the nature of the soul.
So geometry was like intellectual training wheels for philosophy.
In a way, yes. A vital discipline to hone abstract thinking, essential for tackling the big Platonic questions. So her work on commentaries on Diophantus or Apollonius was likely seen as part of that broader philosophical ascent.
Even if we don't have her specific writings on metaphysics.
Exactly. Given the Alexandrian Neoplatonic context, it's highly probable she engaged with those deeper philosophical issues. We can also look at later pagan teachers in Alexandria like Olympiodorus in the 6th century.
What does he tell us?
His situation shows the challenges. He had Christian students and had to tread carefully when discussing traditional myths or potentially sensitive philosophical points. Hypatia would have faced similar, perhaps even more intense, pressures a century earlier.
So navigating this increasingly Christian city as a prominent pagan philosopher and teacher, it must have required real skill and diplomacy.
Absolutely. She was operating at this complex intersection of fading pagan traditions and rising Christian power, all while upholding a rigorous intellectual standard.
Which brings us finally to how she's been remembered her afterlife, so to speak. It's amazing how she keeps reappearing.
It really is quite phenomenal. Her image has been picked up and reshaped by so many different groups for so many different reasons.
Charles Kingsley's novel Hypatia in the 19th century, for example. Very influential if romanticized.
Hugely influential. Then you have pre-Raphaelite paintings, and right up to modern cinema with Alejandro Amenabar's film Agora. Each era seems to find something in her story that resonates.
And she becomes a symbol for, well, lots of different things, doesn't she? Rationality versus fanaticism.
Definitely. A victim of religious intolerance is a very common portrayal. Also, a symbol of female intellectual achievement against patriarchal suppression.
A feminist icon, almost, avant la lettre.
In many interpretations, yes. Her story gets used to argue for reason, for science, for women's rights. Think of Fran Boganol's teaching as Hypatia project today.
Right, using her persona to teach astronomy and highlight women in science. That's fascinating.
It shows her legacy is still active, still being engaged with. Even back in the 18th century Enlightenment, she was a talking point.
Oh, so.
There were debates, could a woman really be that wise? And her death was often cited as a prime example of the dangers of religious fanaticism, fitting neatly with Enlightenment critiques of intolerance.
And Agora, the film, it tried to blend the historical epic with her intellectual life, didn't it?
It did, which is unusual for the genre. It focuses quite a bit on her scientific inquiries, her struggles with astronomical models. It definitely plays with gender stereotypes, the independent woman surrounded by powerful men and religious conflict.
Though it takes historical liberties, of course.
Oh, certainly. But it uses her story to explore those tensions between reason and faith, dogma and inquiry. Maybe even reflects on modern anxieties about extremism, using Alexandria as a sort of historical mirror.
The visual style, too, those shots zooming from the cosmos down to the library.
Yeah, visually trying to connect her vast intellectual quest with the very earthly, violent conflicts that consumed her. It's a powerful cinematic take, even if historians debate the details.
So her appeal is really enduring because she embodies so many different facets. Philosopher, scientist, teacher, woman caught in historical turmoil.
I think that's exactly right. She lived at this intense crossroads of history, and her life, and tragically her death, offer this incredibly potent lens on the ancient world, its intellectual debates, its religious violence, its social dynamics.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear Hypatia was, well, far more complex than any single portrayal suggests. Her connection with Synesius shows this incredibly respected teacher, deeply involved in the intellectual life of her time.
And the accounts of her death, however conflicting, really hammer home the brutal reality of the era she navigated. The religious and political tensions were literally deadly.
And her legacy, the way she's been endlessly reinterpreted in art, books, film, it just shows her enduring power as a symbol of intellect, of science, maybe the risks faced by those who think independently.
Absolutely. Which leads us to maybe a final thought for our listeners to ponder. Considering all these different Hypatias we've encountered, the philosopher, the martyr, the scientist, the feminist icon, and knowing the different motivations behind these portrayals through the centuries.
What does her story, in all its complexity and contradiction, really tell us about how we remember the past? Especially figures who don't fit neatly into the dominant narratives of their time or ours.
Exactly. How do we reconstruct a figure like this shattered icon? It's something worth thinking about. We definitely encourage everyone to explore these sources further and, form their own conclusions.